The BEF, the final verdict. Stupid title. History's a contingent subject. There are no final verdicts in history. I'm not even sure that it will be my final verdict, because I might change my mind if I lecture on this in a year's time. By putting the word final in, I simply wanted to have a benchmark for saying, well, where had the BEF got to by the end of the war, considering where it started from at the beginning. So don't expect, the definitive explanation of the BEF and the First World War. I don't think there will be one. The problem with history, of course, is that the world turns, and when the world turns and people have different views, one of the most moving pieces of writing I've ever read on the First World War is the final chapter of C.W. Bean's History of the Australian Imperial Force in the First World War, which is beautifully written, wonderfully observed, moving, deeply felt, elegiac. And if you compare that view of the Australian soldier in the First World War with some of the views of the Australian soldier which have recently been coming out of Australia, where Australian soldiers are looked at not so much as the heroes of C.W. Bean, but as a bunch of drunken, ill-disciplined, racist rapists. Honestly, you can't make this up. In their attitude to the civilian population of Belgium and France. So, different times, people ask different questions. So there will be no final verdict, and this won't be it. Of that I can guarantee. Now, I've been a professional historian for a long time. I think in some ways it was almost inevitable. I spent most of my very early childhood, when I was very young, primary school age, I spent a lot of time talking to old people. I think this is perhaps less common now than it was in those days. So there is a sense in which I had always lived in the past as well as in the present. And those people who don't have a sense of history are, of course, extremely foolish, because they are living in the past too. It's just that they don't recognise it. So, although I have a job as a historian, it's also the way I look at the world. I can't help it. It doesn't matter what I'm doing, I look at it as a historian. Let me give you an example. I was inveigled by my wife a few years ago to go and watch the musical Chicago in London. I don't like the theatre frightfully much. Musical theatre is not my scene at all. Staying in rubbishy London hotels, where the average room is designed for a hobbit, isn't my idea of a lot of fun either. But we go to this musical, and I enjoyed it, and we came out in Shaftesbury Avenue, and my wife said, "What do you think of that?" I said, "Well, actually, I found myself thinking about the BEF in the First World War." And she said, "Only you could say that." But I did, because it made me think about the way things succeed and fail. I've always been interested in this. I was a civil servant for 2 years after I graduated, and it's interesting to see how organisations work, improve, fail, are changed, the difficulties of changing them, and so on. And this is all magnified and intensified in time of war. But watching this musical, I suppose if you were hypercritical, you'd have said it was slick. But it was slick in the way that it was polished. Nobody put a foot wrong. Nobody fell over. I'm tone deaf, so as far as I know, nobody hit the wrong note. You had the right people in the right jobs. You know, people who were dancers were doing the dancing, and people who were singing could sing were doing the singing, and people who could act were doing the acting, and it was all faultless. I got the impression they might have done it before. So I came out and I thought, well, why has this succeeded? You got the right people in the right place at the right time. You have practice and repetition. And you have a script. They weren't making this up as they go along. They were actually following a script. Now, if you apply these criteria to the British Expeditionary Force in the First World War, none of these things apply. The right people were not in the right place at the right time until much later in the war than 1914, 15, or even 16. There isn't a script to follow, because what they were doing, i.e. the British were doing, was absolutely unique and has remained unprecedented in British military history. No one has ever done or been asked to do, and nobody will ever again be asked to do, what the British Expeditionary Force was asked to do in the First World War. And of course, practice and repetition is costly in war. So when you're practicing and rehearsing Chicago, you know, the director says, well, oh, super darlings, but could we just do that again, you know? I think you're a little bit out with those steps. The difference in wartime is when you have the misstep, somebody dies. Maybe people die in large numbers. And you could regard much of the BEF's experience in the First World War as a series of missteps. In fact, my colleague at Birmingham, who I have a very high regard for, Jonathan Boff, in his excellent book on Third Army in 1918, in the 100 Days, compared the learning process or curve of the BEF as learning to drive by having a series of road crashes. We'll come back to that. So, what made Chicago the slick, polished experience that it was is entirely absent in the history of the BEF in the First World War. Now, history is not only a contingent subject, it's also one which is always about context. And I think here we have a problem because, and I think this became apparent in the commemorations, that most people didn't seem to be able to situate the Great War in the context of what came before, of what the experience of the British Army was before the First World War, what the British Army was actually designed for, which wasn't fighting the First World War. And you've got to have some kind of baseline from which you measure the improvements in the BEF, if you believe that there were improvements. Now, most people do now. I don't think there are any serious academic historians who don't believe that the British Army actually improved, and improved dramatically in its performance in the First World War. Whether this is actually penetrated through to the understanding of the great British people, I'm less certain. Though I think there has been some improvement. There were some people who believe this was a great opportunity, you know, to educate the public. And I think there's been some education of the public as a result of the commemorations. But a lot of it has simply reinforced the traditional stereotypes about the First World War. And there can be no real appreciation of what the British Army achieved in the First World War unless you recognise from where it started from. Now, the role of the British Army before the First World War was established by politicians in the years after 1815. And that role was to be essentially an imperial police force. And it gradually got better at being an imperial police force, not least in the 1880s when they create the 2-battalion system. So you have a battalion always at home and a battalion abroad, and so that the battalion at home can be used for training and reinforcements and so on. And the British Army is, although it fights no major wars between 1815, possibly for the Crimea, until the South African War, it's some bits of it are always in action somewhere or other on the edges of empire. And because the British Empire is so extensive and so different, what the British Army is going to be confronted by on a day-to-day basis is utterly unpredictable. And it's remained so. I mean, if you think of the wars the British Army's fought since 1945, you know, Korea? Well, what odds would you got on that, say, you know, 1946? Anybody think we'll be fighting a war in Korea? Where? Yeah? Utterly unpredictable. So you can't, if you have an army whose only purpose is to do A, let's say, to fight the Soviet Union on the plains of Central Europe, then you can organise it and equip it and train it and develop a doctrine for doing that one thing. But the British Army has never done the one thing. So one week it can be, you know, fighting in temperatures of -17, and the next week it can be fighting in temperatures of 35 degrees in a completely different part of the world. I remember, you know, during the Gulf War, they were having to degrease all their weapons, you know, because the last thing you want is a greasy weapon with a load of sand about. Utterly unpredictable. And so the British Army always developed a reputation for being adaptable, flexible, and pragmatic. And you couldn't draw up for the British Army, given that what its role was supposed to be, you couldn't draw up a kind of, you know, ladybird guide to what the British Army did, because you never knew what it was going to be doing from one year to the next, and neither did they. So it's essentially designed to be an imperial police force. There also remains, in the 19th century, considerable hostility going back 200 years to the idea of any kind of standing army at all in Britain. So Cromwell's major generals cast a long shadow. There is hostility towards service in the army from the working class. Remember the story of Sir William Robertson as he eventually became, going off to war, and his mother being absolutely horrified as a respectable working class woman. You know, that she said something like, "I'd prefer to see you in your grave than in a red coat." And that was a general attitude. So although the people who joined the army in the late 19th century weren't the kind of people Wellington complained about in the 18th, they certainly weren't respectable working class people, the semi-skilled, and much less were they from the, you know, the broad and expanding middle class of the professions and so on. In that sense, the army did not reflect British society, which of course it did come to do during the First World War. So you have an army which is very small by continental standards. I mean, I was recently asked to referee a paper for a journal, and the synopsis at the top, you know, what the article was about, said that the BEF's failure in 1914. Failure? I don't know what the author expected. It was going to march on Berlin. I mean, the BEF in its original incarnation was 4 infantry divisions and eventually a cavalry division, rising to 8 divisions by Christmas 1914 against 200 German divisions. Despite this, it plays a subsidiary but nevertheless significant role in the disruption of the so-called Schlieffen Plan in August and September 1914, and of course in the defence of the Channel ports in October and November 1914. So how you can describe this as failure is beyond me. But the idea that the BEF could have, achieved anything significant in an offensive sense in 1914 or even 1915, and I would probably argue even in 1916. I'm going to give you a view of the development of the British Army in the First World War, which at the end of it you'll wonder, well, why do people generally still, amongst the great public, think it was a study in failure, that the BEF failed in the First World War? Because if you want to drag up for any kind of programme, examples of military stupidity, of, how terrible war is, you come up with examples of the First World War. And this seems to me to be quite strange. Take trench warfare. There's a saying, isn't there, not least in boxing, he's going to take him into the trenches, the fight's going to get really hard and messy. Well, why were people in trenches? Because it was safer than being outside them. Trenches were developed in order to protect soldiers from artillery fire. It wasn't a top-down thing. They didn't stand around getting blown up and then somebody gets a chit and say, dig trench. I mean, they just dug them because it was safer to do so. So, I mean, much of so-called trench, the problem in trench warfare isn't being in the trench, it's when you get out of the trench and try and move forwards that you get the problem. So I found that a bit difficult to understand. And painfully from time to time, I'm reminded that there are lots of people out there who don't see the BEF as having evolved at all. When I was director of the Centre for First World War Studies, I used to take lots of phone calls from the great British public. And what drove this was genealogy. So somebody had been on Ancestry or Find My Past, and they'd located their ancestors' service files by some miracle. And their medical files were there. And they'd phone me up and they'd say, well, I've got these medical files for Great Uncle Bert. And I said, oh yeah, okay. And he said, but, and he had this complicated brain surgery. And I said, yeah? And the lady at the other end says, but they couldn't do that, could they? I said, well, self-evidently, madam, they could, because it's in his file. Because the public view of medicine in the First World War seems to be, Scutari and Florence Nightingale, and it hasn't moved on since then at all. And this is a part of the evolution of the BEF you could regard as not so much evolutionary as revolutionary in all sorts of areas. Surgery, plastic surgery, even eventually to some degree, psychiatric medicine. All these things evolved. They evolved at different rates in different places at different times. And one of the reasons for this is that I had a Korean student, Chang-bu Kang, known as the Mighty Kang, wonderful chap. He's now Professor of Strategy at the Korean War College. So if Kim Jong-un, or whatever his name is overthrown any day soon, I bet Chang-bu Kang's behind it somewhere. And he used to come out with, as a professional airman, he used to come out with these great lines, and he'd say to me, the thing about war is it is time sensitive. Write that down, time sensitive, right? And he said to me one day, he said, the problem with a learning curve is turnover. I said, yes, turnover. He said, first man learn to do job, get good at job, get killed. Second man come, not know how to do job, have to learn to do job, gets better at job, gets killed. Third man come along, he not know how to do job. So, and this, if you talk about the infantry, which he was, because he did his PhD on the infantry office of the British Army in the First World War, special reference to the Royal Warwickshire Regiment. This is true. You get a lot of attrition and wastage, and you're having to reinvent the wheel all the time. But if you're running the third echelon base depot, say with chaps who used to work in Batley Town Hall, I love that poster. What did you do in the Great War, Daddy? And I always wanted to put at the bottom, I filed reports at the third echelon base depot. Somebody had to do it. Douglas Haig understood this because every year as Commander-in-Chief he used to go and visit it. And no one knew the BEF better than Haig. I mean, he's always going around visiting, and he makes notes of, and he makes a reference on one visit, I think it was in 1917, to the health of the regimental sergeant major at the third echelon depot, who had had problems, I think it was with his kidney. And he said, but he now seems in much fuller health. You know, this is Douglas Haig, the man who's remote, who doesn't know what's going on, doesn't relate to ordinary soldiers and so on. But Haig understood just how important this place was, because the BEF by 1916-17, the BEF by 1916 is the second biggest entity in the British Empire after the London County Council. And it does more or less everything the London County Council does, plus fights the German army. And so it is a very complex, multi-layered organisation which doesn't run itself. I think one of the things that bedevils our understanding of the First World War is a concentration on a small number of individuals, of whom one is certainly Haig. Recently, I was sent a quite remarkable piece of work done by a group of enthusiasts in North Staffordshire. One of the key people involved in it I went to school with. And it's on the 1st, 5th Battalion, the North Staffordshire Regiment, and lists over 6,000 people who served in it. And they have there is a history of the battalion, and they still feel badly. We had reference to the 18th West Yorkshire's being disbanded in the winter of 1918. Well, the 1st, 5th North Staffords were amalgamated with the 2nd, 5th North Staffords to be the 5th North Staffords in 59th Division, and then they were reduced to cadre in May 1918. And people in North Staffordshire still take this personally, 100 years later. Why were the 1st, 5th North Staffords picked on? Who picked on us? Haig. Because apparently Haig had only contempt for the territorial battalions. Well, you know, I've edited Haig's diaries. I'm pretty familiar with what Haig wrote and what Haig felt. I've never come across any disdain for territorial battalions. But there's a more serious problem here. Do they actually think that Haig had the time to sit down there, you know, picking on individual battalions? Because when the BEF was reorganised in February, March 1918, the driving force was the War Cabinet, not the BEF. GHQ France didn't want to do it the way it was done. They wanted to have a smaller number of divisions up to full strength. And a political decision was taken not to do this for various reasons. So, you know, there's Douglas Haig thinking, right, which of these battalions don't I like? I'll pick on one of them. Yeah, 1st, 5th North Staffords didn't like them. Well, the point is, once you've made this decision, every brigade has to lose a battalion. And that was the one that was chosen. But it wasn't disbanded, it was amalgamated. In fact, no first-line territorial battalions were disbanded in February, March 1918. A lot of them were amalgamated, but they weren't disbanded, because the instructions that they were given in France from the War Office was to give precedence to regular battalions, first-line territorial battalions, and those battalions of the new army which had been in the field the longest. And this is what they tried to do on the whole. But it wasn't done by Haig. So this idea that Haig has got the time to do this shows a total lack of understanding of how an organisation as complex and large as the BEF actually operated. Now, when Gary Sheffield and I did the Haig papers, we were summoned for a meeting with the publishers, and they wanted to talk about publicity. And they said, well, how are we going to publicise this? You know, what's the, what do they call it, David? USP, yes, unique selling point. So I said, right, got it. I said, this is a book about an important man in the history of the First World War who is nowhere near as important as many people think he is. For some reason, they didn't go for this. I recently read in a book that Haig personally chose his corps commanders. No, he didn't. He didn't choose anybody. Haig's powers of patronage were extremely limited. He didn't even choose his own chief of staff. Who did he want for his chief of staff when he was made commander-in-chief? Richard Butler. Who did he get? Lancelot Kidgell. When Kidgell was replaced, did Haig want him replaced? No, he said, I didn't want him replaced, but he was replaced. So who did he want? He wanted Richard Butler. So who did he get? Herbert Lawrence. He hasn't got any control over this. And neither had people further down. The idea that you could just pick people and promote them on a whim. And one of the big problems we have in understanding how the BEF evolved, going back to Chicago, having the right people in the right place at the right time, is who was responsible for choosing these right people and putting them in the right place at the right time, and what are the criteria for selection? Now, I say, I'm a modest chap, and I say in all modesty, nobody knows more about this subject than I do. And I don't know how the system worked. Well, I know how it worked in theory, but the papers haven't survived because they were bombed by the Germans on the 7th of 8th of September 1940. All the military secretaries' papers were destroyed. So we know that the military secretary's office played a key role. We know that they had subordinate officers that went around sort of talent spotting across the various armies, you know, finding likely chaps to promote. But we've got no idea what criteria they use, except to work backwards and say, well, you know, they've appointed Terry Jackson. What sort of chap was he? Therefore, they must have been looking for these qualities in him, or not, as the case may be. So it's extremely difficult. And this is a major area of any organisation, which is personnel management, leadership and command. And we just don't have the evidence to know exactly how the system operated. My beloved 46th Division, before it broke the Hindenburg Line on the 29th September 1918, had a new commanding officer appointed, Gerald Boyd. He was appointed 24 days before the finest moment of the 46th North Midland Division. And why? Well, it's because his predecessor was removed. He wasn't sacked. He became Director of Military Intelligence at the War Office. This is William Thwaites. He spoke fluent German, so it seemed like a good bet. And they moved him to replace MacDonough in London. So there's a vacancy for a divisional commander. The division had already been identified for this key attack. Now, who'd be worried about this? You think it'd be the corps commander who'd be worried about this, but the corps commander changes 5 days after he's appointed. They get rid of Hamilton Gordon, and he's replaced by Walter Braithwaite. So Boyd is commanding a second-line territorial brigade round Ypres. So who chose this guy? He's only 40 years old. Who brought him forward for this key attack and said, Boyd is your man? We don't know. This is a bit of a problem when you're trying to work out how this organisation actually operated and how it evolved. The fundamental change in the BEF in the First World War is its size. Now, aren't you glad you came? Because I'm sure it never occurred to you this. It got bigger. I was reminded yesterday by my former student, Colonel Alison Hine, whose recent book, Refilling Haig's Armies, is an essential read for anyone who really wants to understand how the BEF worked in the First World War. She pointed out to me that it actually expanded 14-fold. That is an extraordinary level of increase. Astonishing. So we all know this, but what's less commonly understood is that the army not only got bigger, but it was reconfigured. I actually wrote this down. On the 1st of September 1914, 57.56% of the total strength of the army was infantry. By the 1st of October 1918, the proportion of infantry had declined to 32.83%. There were 92,920 officers and men in the artillery on the 1st of August 1914. By 1st of August 1918, there were 548,780. In other words, the Royal Regiment of Artillery, by the 1st of October 1918, is twice the size of the entire British Army that started the war. There were 1,295 officers and 10,394 men in the Royal Engineers on the 1st of August 1914. By the 1st of August 1918, there were 11,830 officers and 225,540 men. So the Royal Engineers is itself the size of the entire British Army in 1914. And as Field Marshal Montgomery famously said, you can never have too many sappers. There'd been an equally huge rise in non-combat support arms. The proportion of the army that was non-combatant doubled from 17.64% of 1st September 1914 to 34.21% on the 1st of October 1918. That's the key figure. I am old enough to have sat through God knows how many political statements, usually by members of the Conservative Party, who've just slashed British defence spending. And they turn to the camera with their "you can trust me, I'm an honest man" face, and say, of course, we're not cutting the teeth, merely the tail. And so the tail is a bunch of wasters, irrelevant. They just sit around all day eating blancmange or something, But as I've already pointed out, if you don't have a tail that works effectively, if you don't have the third echelon base depot, the teeth don't bite. You suddenly find that, you've got no spares, or if you've got any spares, you've got rid of all the clerks so nobody knows where they are, and it goes on like this. By October 1918, 14% of the BEF was Labour Corps. When do you ever see anything written about the Labour Corps? I mean, that's an extraordinary proportion, because it's such a complicated organisation. It's not just blokes in trenches. To keep the blokes in the trenches, to get the blokes out of the trenches and get them moving forward in an effective way, is the result of a massive, sophisticated, evolving system which goes beyond the military. Because the gift of victory in the First World War is not just, possibly even principally, in the hands of the military, but of the British state. Because the other thing that changes dramatically in the First World War is kit. If you look at a British soldier in 1914, he looks like a gamekeeper. He's got a soft hat, he's got a rifle. Pity they didn't give him a shotgun, and do it properly. He walks everywhere. He's not supported by very much heavy artillery. He's got no automatic weapons. He's got no mortars. He's got no hand grenades. 1918, he's awash in hand grenades, heavy machine guns, light machine guns. he's supported by an incredibly sophisticated and powerful artillery. If you look at the two world wars, the most impressive arm of the British forces is undoubtedly the artillery. I mean, the artillery in the First World War becomes an incredibly sophisticated organisation in military terms, but it can only become a sophisticated organisation in military terms because it's backed by the entire resources of the British state and British industry. And developing artillery as a system that integrates with the infantry, that eventually integrates with tanks and with aeroplanes, and is capable of getting soldiers moving forward out of their trenches at acceptable cost and doing violent damage to the Germans as a result of a massive intellectual, economic and industrial effort by the British state. And this is another problem because many people see the British state as failing in the years before the First World War. If you ever want an example of this, it's one of my least favourite films when I had to be physically restrained by my wife from causing an incident. And that film is Titanic. I hate that film. If I ever met the director of Titanic, I think sparks might fly. But of course, it's not about a ship. That's just an analogy. The ship is the British state, sailing heedlessly towards its fate, riven by class distinctions, where the poor people in the steerage, most of them seem to be Irish because you can never say anything nice about English people. God, I hated that film. There's quite a lot of films I hate, actually. And but what the First World War shows is that the British state wasn't failing. It's capable of producing prodigious production. I mean, people think that in the First World War, it was like the Second World War where the Americans are supplying us. You look at American troops in 1918, 17 and 18, they've got British helmets, they've got British rifles, they've got French artillery, I mean, if you think the British started from a low level in 1914, think the Americans in 1917, they'd have come second to the Boy Scouts. I mean, the American army is pitiful. It's very, very small. And they don't get geared up industrially in the same way that they did to fantastic effect in the Second World War. We are the arsenal of democracy in the First World War, not the Americans. And not only supplying manufactured goods, and manufactured goods which had never been manufactured before, and new weapons and new weapon systems and telecommunications and all this kind of thing, but supplying raw materials to our allies, to the French and to the Italians who don't have any coal. So it's massive effort on the part of the British state. And if you're looking for limiting factors in the evolution of the BEF, what slowed it down? Could it have evolved more quickly, more effectively than it actually did? I think, to me, the fundamental thing is manpower and economic planning. And we didn't have any until into 1916, and arguably until later in the war. And it's like the joke about, the Irishman who was asked directions and said, if I were you, I wouldn't start from here. Well, the place where we started from was business as usual. No real fundamental understanding of what the nature of the war would be, how long it would last, how many men we would be required in order to win it, which men we should choose, because we weren't choosing them, they were choosing the army, we weren't choosing the men. So it's a failure to have conscription from the start of the war, to me, as one of the major limiting factors. And, manpower becomes a very serious problem in 1918. Even in the Second World War, where we have this from the beginning, indeed before the war started, you still have a major manpower problem in 1944. And of course, when you're conscripting people in 1944 in Britain, you're conscripting them for service in the pits as much as service in the army. So striking that balance between how many soldiers you need and what kind of workers you need, when some of the workers that you need have already volunteered for the army, and some of them are dead, and some of them won't come back even if you ask them nicely, it puts you in a very difficult position. So it's only gradually developing the Ministry of National Service and so on. Colonel Hine has shown quite categorically that Lloyd George was not holding men back from Haig at the start of 1918. The problem is there is a real concern about how many men you can have in the armed forces and how many you need for the war economy. And trying to sort this out is not straightforward. And because you haven't got direction of labour, you might have direction of soldiers by then, but not direction of labour because of the attitude of the trade unions, then it's very difficult to do this kind of thing. But despite this, we achieve prodigies of production. We produce high quality new weapons and explosives. My own university, the University of Birmingham, where I spent 30 years, its great claim to winning the First World War was testing shells. Anybody ever got the VC for this? No. Probably haven't got the MBE for it, let alone the VC. But it's vital work, because we all know the troops come out of the ground on the 1st of July 1916, and they were somewhat discouraged going across no man's land by the number of dud shells that they were going past. So actually having shells that go bang when you fire them, I mean, basically the British artillery in 1916 found it impossible to identify targets accurately. It found it difficult to hit them, and if it hit them, it didn't destroy them. So apart from that, it was quite good. But by 1918, you have incredibly sophisticated target acquisition systems, which requires a massive intellectual effort, which Peter Chassot famously described as the Manhattan Project of the First World War, in the sense that it cost a lot of money and you got your finest minds trying to do flash spotting and sound ranging and so on, so that you could identify enemy targets that you couldn't see because they were at the other side of the hill, and you had very powerful shells with destructive fuses that didn't bury themselves in the ground and go bang. You know, all that famous films of 1916, people think it's smoke going in the air when the shell goes bang. It's soil. Big hole in ground, it rains, hole fills up with water. You've got the classic muddy battlefield of the First World War. Later, you've got virtual total conversion to high explosive, whereas mostly using shrapnel on the 1st of July 1916, which is very good at shredding barbed wire if it can be fired with total accuracy, which it wasn't. So by the time you got the instant percussion fuses, it shreds barbed wire. It just doesn't blow it up in the air and it come back down again, which is what happens in 1916. I mean, this is an extraordinarily powerful weapon. And the other thing is, you have vast quantities of it. I've often said that the 100 Days is the only time in British military history when the British fought a rich man's war. Now, we fought a rich man's war with the Americans' riches in the Second World War, but in the First World War, it was our own stuff. There are no limits. I mean, the thing about war is it's totally inefficient. It's no good saying, now look, if we think this through properly, you'll only have to fire 3 shells. Oh, right, okay. You need lots of shells. You don't need to have to worry that you're going to run out of them like 1915. In the 100 Days, the British 18-pounder field guns were firing on average 100,000 rounds a day. And there was plenty more where it came from. The only thing we were short of in the 100 Days were tanks. We could never produce enough tanks. They were okay on day 1, and by day 3 there were 3 of them left. The problem with tank production is it's cutting edge. So by the time, Haig sees a tank, and he said, wow, just what we need. Let me have 1,000. As soon as possible. He never gets 1,000 at any stage during the war, but by the time they're ready to go into mass production, someone will say, well, actually, this tank's rubbish. We've got a much better one here, the Mark II. Let's go into mass production on that. Okay, and they get to that stage and they say, actually, this bit rubbish as well. About this one, the Mark III. And it's chasing the technology all the time. And so we never produce, we can never produce enough tanks to really convert to proper armoured warfare. But where we do use tanks in the 100 days, we always prevail. Always. We prevail most of the time if we fight an infantry artillery integrated battle, and we don't prevail if we only fight an infantry battle. So the resources of the British state are fundamentally necessary in order for the British Army to evolve and to be an instrument capable of taking on and defeating the Germans. Now, one of the things that has changed enormously, not least due to my friend and former student Rob Thompson's evangelical missions about the Western Front Association, famously described by Major Ian Passingham as the motorcycling logistician, that logistics is very important. I once saw Air Vice Marshal Peter Dye give a lecture, and he said, some people think logistics is a word taken from the French, some people think it is a word taken from the Greeks, some people think it is American for truck driving. But whatever it is, it's warehousing and distribution. But behind warehousing and distribution, you must have the power of production. But once you've got production, as Rob has pointed out on numerous occasions, by 1918, you had the ability to move the fruits of British industry, by now fully mobilised, to get to the right place at the right time, which is compared with modern just-in-time methods of supplying industry. So the bloke in the front line says, more bullets, please. But it just comes up the line and bonk, he's got them. I mean, it's just extraordinary what they could do. I was reading on the train today, at least until a load of drunken Geordies got on at Sheffield, a book which is going to be on the history of Wolverhampton, the First World War. And the presiding genius of this is an old chum of mine, Jim Barrow, I went to school with. And I read the first chapter, which was on the Sankey family. The Sankeys were a metal-bashing family in Bilston, and their great claim to fame in the First World War was the Brodie helmet. They made over 5.5 million of these Brodie helmets, one based on good Sheffield steel from Hadfields. And, but two of the sons were in the army. One was killed by a sniper in September 1915, and the other one went right through the war. He was a gunner. And it's quite extraordinary. The family sent in, every week of the war, a supply of coal. A supply of mineral water, a small piano, not every week of the war, they only sent in one. He developed a trench periscope for which he got a patent, but decided it was better to nick a German one, it'd be quicker. And also he got one of his cousins and the factory in Bilston to design a more effective telephone switchboard, which they brought over as well. Now, this week I had to send my friend Peter Simpkins some materials we'd been sent from Australia and about Pompey Elliott. I call this Operation Pompey. So Operation Pompey Phase 1 is I had to get a jiffy bag capable of putting this in. That took 2 days. And then I live 3 miles from the centre of one of the largest cities in Europe, and I live nowhere near a bloody post office. It's a nightmare getting anything posted. So I mentioned to Peter that Phase 1 had been completed, but Phase 2 might take a little longer. And I got this thing back from Simo saying that post office was a thorough national disgrace and it was much better in the First World War than it was now. I thought Simo doesn't realise how good it was if they can deliver, 100 weight of coal every day, every week of the year to this obscure, gunner subaltern, you know, somewhere in France. His brother officers loved him, you know. They living it up. They had coal, they had mineral water, they had this piano, and they've got excellent stuff, you know. That's just extraordinary what can be achieved. It also shows that the evolution of the BF isn't just top down. You know, you've got people, active, intelligent people at the bottom thinking, oh, this doesn't work very well, how can we improve it? And also, in all sorts of ways. I remember being deeply impressed a few years ago, reading about an infantry subaltern who decided to cut notches in the handles of grenade boxes. So you pick them up in the dark, and if you had a notch in the handle, it meant they were fused. So it's no good picking up one that, you know, and throwing them at the Germans and knocking them out, you know, with like that. I thought that shows initiative, it shows enterprise. Nobody told him to do this. He didn't get a chit from GHQ saying, from now on, all grenade boxes will have notches in if they are fused. He just did it because they've got every incentive to try and find a better way of doing it, because a better way of doing it is more likely to keep you alive and defeat the enemy. So logistics is very important, and we got really much, much better at logistics. But one of the reasons you're getting better at logistics is you don't have the problem of turnover to anything like the same extent. So if you've got good people who are learning from experience, which they will if they are good people, and they're not being killed at regular intervals, you can expect a much smoother learning curve than you get at the sharp end in the infantry. And I think that's undoubtedly the case. I recently did a comparison between the battalion commanders of the 46th Division just before their first major battle at Loos in September 1915, and before their great moment in breaking the Hindenburg Line at Bellinglees in September 1918. Compared the commanding officers on both occasions, and compared the junior officers, the platoon commanders in 1915 and the platoon commanders in 1918. The huge difference is in their ages. You got some quite elderly chaps commanding battalions in 1915. In 1918, they are, you know, getting on for 20 years younger. There are a huge number of battalion commanders in the BEF in the 100 days who are in their early 20s. Most of them are regulars. There are some that aren't. Some are Dominion officers. One or two are New Army. But I remember the late Richard Holmes saying to me once, said if you wanted to be a battalion commander in 1918, you had to be a regular lieutenant in 1914 and still be alive. Similarly, if you wanted to be commanding a brigade in the end of the war, you needed to be a regular captain in 1914 and still be alive, because there was a diminishing number of these. But it shows how, when we're talking about a learning curve, in the end, no matter who's thinking up the great ideas, how much kit they've got, what they're going to do with it, has to be delivered by individuals. And these individuals at the sharp end are overwhelmingly not regular soldiers. They are overwhelmingly people who would never have gone anywhere near the army but for the outbreak of the First World War. And this is the second thing that will make your visit this afternoon entirely worthwhile, apart from me telling you that the British Army got bigger in the First World War. And that is that the First World War was a very short war. For the conventional viewers, it was a long war because it wasn't over by Christmas. This is one of the great remaining myths of the First World War. I've read it 3 times this week. People say, people thought it would be over by Christmas. What a load of rubbish. Of course they didn't. Stephen Badsey, who knows about these things, said he's never seen any reference to the idea of the war being over by Christmas before 1917. Katrina Pennell, on her book about how the First World War was, the outbreak of the First World War was responded to in Britain, completely demolished this idea. I mean, what is the point of volunteering for military service in the middle of September 1914 if you think the war's going to be over by Christmas? You wouldn't even got a uniform by then. It's mad. It's a very short war, 52 months. Britain doesn't play a major part in the Western Front until the 24th month, which is July 1916. It doesn't become the most important army in the West, Allied army in the West, until June 1917. This is an incredibly telescope period to evolve from a small colonial police force with virtually no heavy artillery, no script, no idea that you were ever going to fight this kind of war. And you have the rapid 14-fold increase in the size of your army, which has to be trained, which has to be equipped, which has to be disciplined and led and learn from experience. It's incredibly difficult. I mean, you go down the job centre, sir. Let's say it's 1915. And they say, well, you know, I'm looking for a new job. They say, well, we've got a cracking job here. Commander-in-Chief, British Expeditionary Force. Do you fancy it? It's like one of those jobs in football, and you think, don't fancy this one. There are good times to be a manager of certain clubs, mentioning no clubs in particular. And there are bad times to be managers of certain clubs. And, you know, obviously a lot of managers don't know the difference. But my God, you know. So the job description is taking on the best trained army in the world on foreign soil, that is foreign to us. They've seized the strategic initiative. The job description is drive the German army off French and Belgian soil. You have an army which is very small still, very badly trained, not very well equipped, and you're having to deal with the political pressures of the alliance at the same time. And you think, God, whenever I think about the BEF in the First World War, the wonder is that things weren't a lot worse, not that they weren't a lot better. Now, a lot of attention has been given in recent years, not least by the prize-winning book by a former Birmingham student as well, Amy Fox, that won the Templar Medal First Book Prize recently, on the actual learning process. You know, how did they learn? Did they learn? Was there any sense that they were intellectually engaged with the problems of fighting this war? Did they stand back and analyse it? A.J.P. Taylor famously said the only thing the British Army learned in the First World War was how to repeat its mistakes on an ever bigger scale. Now, this seems bonkers to me, because if you spend 5 minutes with any operational level war diary, say Corps upwards, they're always trying to do this. They're always analysing what went wrong. I've just written a foreword for a book on called Lessons from the Mud, published by Helion, which is the analysis in 55th West Lancashire Division by its extremely able commanding officer Hugh Judwine, of what went wrong and what went right at Passchendaele. And he actually sent a questionnaire around. Do you get that all the time? I can't visit a National Trust property without they send me an email, you know, asking what I thought of the toilets or the scones or something. And that's commonplace now. It wasn't then. So, and he didn't just send it round to battalion commanders. He tried to get down to, you know, the chaps in the trenches. And although my friend Ian Riley, who knows all about 55th West Lancashire Division, says some of it looks like, you know, the homework was marked before it was returned, there is on Judwine's part, there's a genuine attempt to find out what worked, what didn't, and to make things better the next time round. But you can always find examples in any organisation of good practice and bad practice. The question is, was it ever systematised at an army level? And I think the argument there is it's probably later in the day than it ought to have been. I mean, they start producing how to do it documents, the stationary service documents, really from the end of the Somme. The Somme is the great learning lesson of the British Army in the First World War. And of course, a profound shock in every way, shape and form. So they've got all this material to work on, so they analyse it and then they try to codify it and then they send it out. Paddy Griffith was the first person who really looked at this and said, you look at what they're doing here, you know, this is, it's only the Germans who are supposed to do this, but we're doing it. Then the next question is anybody taking any notice of it? You might give them a chit saying, you know, how to improve your Lewis gun tactics, but is anyone actually doing it? And I think it is clear that even in the 100 days, there are some divisions which are much more cutting edge and up to date and state of the art in terms of their tactics and their operational method than other divisions which are more staid. But there are clearly an improvement and a learning curve. By the second half of 1918, the British Army is capable of putting on large-scale military operations against still formidable enemy in a very short space of time and making them effective. This is a revolution since 1916. How long does it take to plan the disaster that is the 1st of July 1916? And you've got hard-working, intelligent, committed men with a strong sense of duty sit around for weeks, months, planning this. And look what happens. In 1918, somebody says, well, I think we'll attack there. 4 days later, they attack there and they prevail. Well, partly they prevail because they have a load of stuff they didn't have in 1916, but also because they know how to use it most effectively. However, it's still costly. The truest statement ever made about the First World War at the military level was made by French General Charles Mangin when he said, whatever you do, you lose a lot of men. And that's a profound truth. And I think still the thing which most inhibits what I would regard as a true and reasonable understanding of what the British Army achieved or failed to achieve in the First World War remains the casualties, because they were unique in the British experience and have happily remained unprecedented. So they get in the way all the time. When this is allied to the lines on the map not moving very far, I watched that James Holland programme the other day. In fact, I missed the James Holland programme, but went through and found out it was on at 3 o'clock in the morning as a repeat. So I recorded it and watched it last night. And James Holland was talking about Caen in 1944 and the way the politicians and even Eisenhower were getting worried because the lines weren't moving forward very much. The fact that 60% of the German armour was being obliterated during this battle seemed to pass people by. And you can have battles on the Eastern Front where, you know, the line moves 200, 300 miles because you could trade space for time. You can't do this on the Western Front. You couldn't do it if you were Germans in Normandy in 44. And when you got pinned down, you got smashed, and then you got broken. And that's essentially what the British Army is doing in the First World War in 1918. The Germans get pinned down, they get smashed by British artillery, the infantry moves forward, repeat. But the point is you can repeat it quickly. In 1916, the British Army is only capable of organising, after a long period of preparation, one offensive on one front. In 1918, it's got 5 armies going forward simultaneously. The 29th of September 1918, every one of the 5 armies is engaged with the Germans. So in 1916, to use a boxing phrase, you'd give the BEF a puncher's chance. Not very skillful, but you know, if you land one smack on the Germans, maybe they'll fall over. And I think as clumsy and as unsophisticated as the BEF's operational method was in 1916, it would have flattened armies less resilient than the German army. But in my father, I was thinking this about the defeat of Anthony Joshua the other week. My father would have said too many muscles. He didn't think boxers should have muscles. His idea of a boxer was someone like Joe Calzaghe, you know. And he didn't think much of heavyweights, apart from Joe Louis. My dad was a middleweight. He was a very good middleweight. And he thought, well, beyond that, you know, it's basically brawn and no brains. But the BEF in 1918 is like a middleweight. Some middleweights punch like heavyweights, but they move like lightweights. So you can jab and move, jab and move. And what you don't do is what you have in 16, to some extent in 17, which is constantly reinforcing failure. The low point of the British Army in the First World War is High Wood in 1916. You organise an attack, it takes weeks to do it, you've got proper artillery support, and it fails. So they say, well, it's failed. Do it again, without proper artillery support, without equivalent amount of preparation, do it again, fails. Well, twice it's failed, do it now, get it right the third time. It doesn't work, it diminishes. The big change in 1918, sort of 3 days into the Battle of Amiens, is to switch the attack. So by the time the Germans have been sucked in, and they always get sucked in, and they always stop an attack eventually, it grinds down, as you move it somewhere else. And you can only do that if you have lots of kit, if you have a sophisticated logistics and transport system, and if you have the staff officers capable of organising it. Otherwise, your army just gets lost, you know, wandering around France looking for a battle. And this is a huge change. I mean, sometimes trying to get through to people who think it's all about climbing out of a trench and getting machine gunned and there's nothing more to it, trying to get them to understand what a profound shift this is that requires the full mobilisation of the British state in order to do this, and in a terribly short space of time against a formidable enemy. So, my concluding peroration, I've written it down. The BEF grew in a short space of time from a small colonial police force equipped for counter-insurgency operations into a mighty army capable of delivering efficiently organised industrial violence at short notice in high-tempo operations against a major military power. Does this amount to a national triumph, or was it a painful example of learning how to drive by having a series of expensive car wrecks? I leave the final verdict to you. Thank you.
I know where he is. If you want to find